Hi, welcome back to our study of the Gospel of Matthew. We are now in lesson 14, chapters 23 and 24. Now, last lesson, where did we leave Jesus? He was teaching in the temple, wasn't he? And he's still there. And this section will begin the last teaching block. I told you that Matthew had 5 teaching blocks in it of teachings and sayings that Jesus would teach the people. And Matthew has grouped them all together. This is the last one. Now, the first one, remember, was the Sermon on the Mount. It was long, and we split it into 2 lessons. This one is also long. We will also split this into 2 lessons. In fact, when I get to the woes in a few verses, I will also be bringing some of the Beatitudes from the first teaching block into this lesson. All right, so let's get started. Then Jesus said to the crowds and to his disciples. Now, he was teaching in Jerusalem in the temple courts. This right here is a model of Jerusalem. You can see these are people over here, so they're not giants. They're just people looking at this model of ancient Jerusalem when there was still a temple there. And here is another look at it. This is looking out to that side, and this one is more looking out to that side. So this is a little bit better view of the temple. The people that you just saw were standing like right here. Here's a rail. They were standing right here looking at the Temple Mount. It's called the Temple Mount. Okay, so this is where Jesus was. Now, he wasn't here. He was probably out in a different courtyard area. Probably the court of the Gentiles. All right, so it says he has crowds around him. His disciples are with him. And he says, the teachers of the law and the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat. So you must be careful to do everything they tell you. But do not do what they do, for they do not practice what they preach. Now, do you think the teachers of the law and the Pharisees heard what Jesus was saying? Very likely, because they were in the temple area a lot. Also, this was around Passover, and another reason is they wanted to keep an eye on Jesus. They wanted to hear what he was saying. So I'm sure that they were paying attention, maybe not liking what he had to say here. So let's look at some hypocritical descriptions. They do not practice what they preach. They tie up heavy, cumbersome loads and put them on other people's shoulders. But they themselves are not willing to lift a finger to move them. So they shoulder burdens required for others. It was like they were saying, hey, take this big pack, put it on your shoulders. Okay. So they're willing to put it on their shoulders, but they don't want to carry it. They don't want to help you carry it. They want you to carry the whole thing. Everything, verse 5, everything they do is done for people to see. They make their phylacteries wide and the tassels on their garments long. So they use religious ornaments to display piety. Now, do you know what phylacteries are? You find God telling them to use phylacteries or to make them in Exodus 13, Deuteronomy 6, and Deuteronomy 11. They were little leather boxes that they made, and they put scriptures inside, and there were specific scriptures that were supposed to go in there. The bigger ones were to be worn on the forehead, and the smaller ones were to be worn on the wrist. And most Jews would do this, small ones, but the teachers of the law, the Pharisees, they wanted to be very showy, so they had bigger ones on their wrists, and they had a big one on their forehead. And then these tassels, this is found in Numbers 15 and Deuteronomy 22. It was like fringe that God wanted them to put them on the bottom of their garments. Well, the Pharisees and teachers of the law, they would make theirs really long and very showy to display their piety. All right, verse 6. They love the place of honor at banquets and the most important seats in the synagogue. They love to be greeted with respect in the marketplaces and to be called rabbi by others. So they love these titles of honor. Rabbi means my great one. Oh, my great one, rabbi. Well, Jesus said in verse 8, you are not to be called rabbi, for you have one teacher, and you are all brothers. So we have one spirit. We have one teacher, which is Jesus, right? Jesus is also reminding them that they were to think of one another as brothers. As Jews, there were a lot of factions. You know, the Pharisee faction, the Sadducee faction. They had the Zealots, different factions. And sometimes they would be against each other, plotting against each other. And Jesus is saying, you are brothers. Treat everyone, treat yourselves, one another, as brothers. Then he says, and do not call anyone on earth father, for you have one Father, and he is in heaven. Now, we all have a biological father that we can call father. It's not talking about that. He's talking about a spiritual father. Don't designate some human to be a spiritual father for you, because there is one Father in heaven. Now, Paul did refer to himself as Father in 1 Corinthians 4, verse 15. But he was doing this because he had brought several people into Christ. And he was like their father in the faith, but he was not saying to address him as Father, like, oh, great Father. So we should not exalt one another to a special place in a religious sense, not one above another. Continuing in verse 10, nor are you to be called instructors or teachers, for you have one instructor, the Messiah. Now, we don't have the Messiah on earth with us, but the Messiah is still our instructor through the Word of God, isn't he? Then he says, verse 11, the greatest among you will be your servant. So, for those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. So, now he had taught this principle to his disciples already, hadn't he? His disciples hopefully have understood it a little bit better by now. At first they were not getting that. But now he's teaching the crowds, humble yourselves and you will be exalted. Verse 13, before we get into the woes, I do want to tell you that I have skipped verse 14. It's not in my Bible. So evidently verse 14 is not in all manuscripts, and so it was not in my Bible, and I did not notice it not being there until I had finished my lesson, and so I decided that was okay. But I wanted to let you know about that. So verse 13, woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! Now we weren't Jesus talking to them and telling them that they're hypocrites before? Yes, we have. John the Baptist told them that they were hypocrites as well. You shut the door of the kingdom of heaven in people's faces. You yourselves do not enter, nor will you let those enter who are trying to. So what's he saying here? How are they shutting the door, keeping people out that want to be in the kingdom of heaven? Well, they, instead of teaching God's law, they are putting emphasis on man-made traditions. We've talked about this many times. And Jesus is saying this is going to keep not only them out, but the people they are teaching out. So, they are proud in spirit. But we must be poor in spirit. Open the door. Lead either others in. I can't seem to say that. Lead others in. Help others find the way and teach only the truth. Only the truth. No creed, just the truth of God's word. So, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. All right, verse 15. Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You travel over land and sea to win a single convert. And when you have succeeded, you make them twice as much a child of hell as you are. So it seems that he's saying they are proud to send souls to hell. Now, are they telling people they're sending souls to hell? Do they think they're sending souls to hell? No. But Jesus tells them they are. Because the Pharisees are winning them over to their legalistic system, not to the mercy, justice, and grace of God. So, instead of saving souls, they were condemning them. And when he says a child of hell rejects God's way of salvation. And they often, when one is taught something and they believe it wholeheartedly, sometimes but they become even more zealous than their teacher. And so Jesus said, you make them twice as much a child of hell as you are. So, the way of God is open to everyone, all nations now. But who's going to inherit that? God wants everyone to come, everyone on earth to come to him. So, let's see. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Continuing on with verse 16. Oh, woe to you, blind guides! You say, if anyone swears by the temple, it means nothing. But anyone who swears by the gold of the temple is bound by that oath. You blind fools! Which is greater, the gold or the temple that makes gold sacred? You also say, if anyone swears by the altar, it means nothing. But anyone who swears by the gift on the altar is bound by that oath. You blind men! Which is greater, the gift or the altar that makes the gift sacred? Therefore, anyone who swears by the altar swears by it and by everything on it. And everyone who swears by the temple swears by it and the one who dwells in it. And anyone who swears by heaven swears by God's throne and by the one who sits on it. Now, why was he saying this? We've talked before about their oaths. So let's go back to that. They were blind to the true values of the law of God. And he was probably here making a spoof on their legalistic methods of evading an oath by calling them blind. Now, What do you mean by evading an oath? An oath is an oath. Well, no. Remember we talked about as children, we would make a promise and we would cross our fingers and hold them behind our back, because if you promise and you did that, well, it wasn't real. You didn't have to do it. Okay? And we know now that that is not true. Your word is your word, whether your fingers are crossed or not. But legally, the Pharisees were making it so that they could take an oath. They wanted to be able to get out of the oath if they decided they didn't really want to do that, whatever the oath was. So they sort of made a back door so they could get out of it. And they said, let's see, oaths were only binding if the name of God was used. So if you said, I swear by the temple of God, well, that was binding. But if you said, I swear by the gold on the temple, that wasn't binding, because you weren't using the name of God. If you say, I swear by the altar of God, it's binding. But if you say, I swear by the gift on the altar, then it's not binding. And here Jesus is saying, no, it is binding. So, and they were basically robbing God by not fulfilling their oaths. They were also often robbing people as well. But they were doing it legalistically, because they still wanted to look pious. Well, Jesus calls them out on it, didn't he? And he made fun of them. Everybody knew what was going on with that. So, they were being blind. But what does God say? Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, and they will be filled. The Pharisees were doing what was wrong. They were trying to get out of doing what was right. But we are to hunger and thirst for righteousness. All right, let's go to verse 23. Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You give 1/10 of your spices, mint, dill, and cumin, but you have neglected the more important matters of the law: justice, mercy, and faithfulness. You should have practiced the latter without neglecting the former. Oh, you blind guides, you strain out a gnat but swallow a camel. What is he saying here? I've got reject mercy on here because they've rejected mercy, they've rejected justice and faithfulness, but they take these herbs, these little plants, and they examine them and they make sure they get exactly 1/10 on there of these little bitty spices, these little bitty herb plants. But they don't seem to feel that justice, mercy, and faithfulness is necessary. And so he gives this illustration to the crowd of them straining out a gnat from their wine. Gnats were insects which were unclean, so they didn't want to have something unclean in their wine, and so they would make sure that they strained the wine to make sure no gnats were in there that they would swallow. But Jesus is saying, oh, really? You strain out this little bitty gnat, but you're swallowing a camel. And I'm sure that he got a big laugh out of that from the crowd. He likes to do stuff like that. It catches their attention. And so, I've got here, obtain mercy. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. Verse 25, woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You clean the outside of the cup and dish, but inside they are full of greed and self-indulgence. Blind Pharisee, first clean the inside of the cup and dish, and then the outside also will be clean. He's talking about them. They're so careful about being ceremonially clean on the outside, not touching anything that's unclean. But inside, they are full of greed and self-indulgence. Verse 27, woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites. You're like whitewashed tombs. He continues on with this theme, which look beautiful on the outside, but on the inside are full of the bones of the dead and everything unclean. In the same way, you appear to people as righteous on the outside, but on the inside, you are full of hypocrisy and wickedness. He was letting them have it, wasn't he? I want to visit the tomb thing a little bit more. In fact, we're talking about them being defiled in heart. They didn't want to be defiled on the outside and be unclean, but they were defiled on the inside. So, God wants us to be pure in heart, doesn't he? Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Now, I'm going to give you a picture here of the Kidron Valley. There are tombs all back in here, and you see how white they are? They would whitewash the tombs. Why would they whitewash them? Well, they wanted them to be obvious to travelers, because often tombs were like on the side of the road. They were just right there by the road. And when there was a feast coming up, they would have lots of travelers come into Jerusalem. Well, they didn't want them to defile themselves by accidentally touching a tomb. So then they would be unclean ceremonially and would not be able to partake of the feast. So they wanted to make it very obvious that these were untouchable, they were tombs, so they would whitewash them. And it said when you would be coming close to Jerusalem and you would see it afar off, you would see these white buildings, all this white, and it would actually look beautiful. But what was inside? Dead bodies. Dead bodies were inside. Dead men's bones. So they looked beautiful on the outside, but on the inside, they were full of decay. All right, now let's go to verse 29. Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You build tombs for the prophets and decorate the graves of the righteous. And you say, if we had lived in the days of our ancestors, we would not have taken part with them in shedding the blood of the prophets. So, you testify against yourselves that you are the descendants of those who murdered the prophets. Go ahead then and complete what your ancestors started. So what did he mean here when he says complete what your ancestors started? I think he means you're going to complete it by you yourselves killing the Son of God. Verse 33, you snakes, you brood of vipers, how will you escape being condemned to hell? Here he's almost sad, isn't he? How are you going to escape? I know, he's so angry with them, isn't he? But still, he loves them. He doesn't want them to go to hell. He wants them to turn back to God. So, he says, verse 34, therefore I am sending you prophets and sages and teachers. Some of them you will kill and crucify. Others you will flog in your synagogues and pursue from town to town. And so upon you will come all the righteous blood that has been shed on earth, from the blood of righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah, son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the temple and the altar. So they are persecutors. But he wants us to be peacemakers. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. He talks of Abel, from the blood of Abel to the blood of Zechariah. He's talking about the whole of Jewish history from the beginning to the end. Abel was the first person to be murdered because he was righteous. And at the end of Jewish history, the written Jewish history they had, which ends in 2 Chronicles 36, chapter 36, that is the end of their history. Zechariah, you find this story in 2 Chronicles chapter 24, verses 20 to 22. And it talks of Zechariah, son of Jehoiada. Now, I don't know why it says son of Berechiah here. He was actually Jehoiada's son. But he said he was murdered between the temple and the altar by order of King Joash. Then verse 36 through 39 are Jesus' final words to the Pharisees and the teachers of the law. Truly, I tell you, all this will come on this generation. Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you who kill the prophets and stone those sent to you. How often I have longed to gather your children together as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, and you are not willing. Look, your house is left to you desolate, for I tell you, you will not see me again until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. So this is a little bit about the prophecy of the destruction of the city of Jerusalem. When he says your house is left to you desolate. And Jesus is sad. For centuries, Jerusalem had been the center of religious activity for the Jews, for God's people, but now the end is near. Not only his death, but the end of the Jewish religion as they know it. It was all going to change. And it would be a definite change when Jerusalem was destroyed, or is destroyed. The Passover is now 2 days away, and we find this in Matthew 26, verse 2, where he will be handed over to be crucified. Let's move on to chapter 24 now, verse 1. Jesus left the temple and was walking away when his disciples came up to him to call his attention to its buildings. Now, before we completely leave, I want to go back to the temple and just to show you a couple of pictures. Behind the Temple Mount is a wall, the back part of the wall, and it is still standing. It is now known as the Wailing Wall. This is the back of the wall. And it in the front of here would have been where the temple was, but this is the back part of the wall, and this is now known as the Wailing Wall, where Jews go and they will write down their prayers and they will put it through cracks. Now this, Jesus is about to go up, walk up to the Mount of Olives. This is where this picture was taken, from the Mount of Olives looking toward modern Jerusalem. Of course, it doesn't look the same, but I just wanted you to get a perspective of that. Now, as they are walking out of the temple, the disciples are saying, look at this amazing building. And it was like, you know, we talk about the 7 wonders of the world. It was one of the wonders of the ancient world. This magnificent building Herod the Great had built it. It was made with white marble, plated in gold, and when the sun shone on it at a certain time of day, it was blinding to travelers coming into Jerusalem. Stones have been excavated here that they found them to be 20 to 40 feet long. That's huge. And they weigh over 100 tons. 100 tons. Do the math. 100 times 200,000 pounds. How in the world did they get them stacked one on top of the other? Today, that is still a mystery how that was done. But Jesus says to them, "Do you see all these things?" he asked. Truly, I tell you, not one stone here will be left on another. Every one will be thrown down. As Jesus was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately. They're about to ask him a question, and the reason they've been thinking about this, and they're thinking the only way that these stones could be knocked off each other is if the end of the world came. That's the only possible way. So they are thinking not only of this destruction that Jesus seems to be talking about, but also about the end of the world. Because to them, that's the only way that Jerusalem could be destroyed. So this is what they asked. Oh, and by the way, here it says privately, but if you go to Mark 13, verse 3, you will find out that the disciples who asked were Peter, Andrew, James, and John. So they said, "Tell us, when will this happen? And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?" All right, so I want us to remember this as we go through this part. This will be something that we'll need to focus on. These questions. When will this happen? This destruction happen? What will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? They're putting the coming of Jesus and the end of the age together. Jesus answered, "Watch out that no one deceives you. For many will come in my name, claiming, 'I am the Messiah,' and will deceive many." Okay, this is going to be the first sign. They want to know, when will this happen? This is going to be the sign of when it happens. There are going to be these false messiahs. Now, if people believe that these false messiahs, or if one of them is the true Messiah, what does that mean about Christ? What are they saying about Christ? That he's not the Christ. So they would be denying the Christhood of Jesus. Anyone who leaves Christ and follows another Christ is denying Christ. All right, so don't be deceived. You will hear of wars and rumors of wars, but see to it that you are not alarmed. Such things must happen, but the end is still to come. There were 3 threats of war made against the Jews by Roman emperors. And then there were also 3 uprisings of the Gentiles against Jews. Nation will rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom. There will be famines and earthquakes in various places. Prior to AD 70, 5 earthquakes were recorded in history. And numerous famines were recorded by Roman writers. These signs were fulfilled. Jesus said in verse 8, all these are the beginning of birth pains. So, birth pains are signs of new life, okay? These signs were fulfilled. They would confirm the faith of the disciples of Christ, wouldn't they? Because Jesus had told them. Now, verse 9. Then you will be handed over to be persecuted and put to death, and you will be hated by all nations because of me. Now this word then in verse 9, it's not in sequence. It's more like then also. Then also. The persecution would happen between now and AD 70. Just like the rumors of wars, the famines, the earthquakes. So, and this was going to happen, wasn't it? The book of Acts gives us abundant evidence of this. Paul suffered greatly by the Jews. We find this in 1 Corinthians 11, verses 24 to 28. And then in verse 10, he says, at that time many will turn away from the faith and will betray and hate each other. And many false prophets will appear and deceive many people. Now, in verse 12, because of the increase of wickedness, the love of most will grow cold. Because of this, what he's talking about in verse 10, many will turn away from the faith and betray and hate each other. Because of this increase of wickedness, the love of most will grow cold. But he who stands firm till the end will be saved. Now, when it talks about false prophets in verse 11, this happened. Paul refers to false prophets. In 2 Corinthians 11, verses 13 and 15, we find it in several places in the New Testament about things that were happening in the early church. This word end in verse 13, when he says, he who stands firm to the end will be saved, this is probably talking about the end of one's life. So stand firm to the end. Like when Paul, you remember when he was talking about finishing the race? He's talking about the race, the end of your life, finishing well at the end. So this is probably what this is talking about. Now verse 14 though, he says, and this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all nations. And then the end will come. Now, the gospel was preached to all nations before AD 70, wasn't it? We can go to Colossians verse 1:23, and Paul says that it has been preached to all the known world at least. Then the end will come. And this is talking about a different end. This is, I believe, the end is of the Jewish religion as they knew it. Now, we are getting into some difficult scripture here. I will tell you that I used 4 different commentaries, studied on this, and they all 4 gave me different insights to this. So I'm not a scholar, and I have not been in class learning about things like this. I just study from a class. And you may agree or disagree with what I have gleaned from my study, but I am happy to have any comments or questions that you have. I may not be able to answer the questions, but comments, of course, are always welcome. But I say that before we get started, so you will know that that I am not an expert on this. So let's continue. The end, I believe, is the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. He continues on in verse 15. So when you see standing in the holy place the abomination that causes desolation spoken of through the prophet Daniel, let the reader understand, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let no one on the housetop go down to take anything out of the house. Let no one in the field go back to get their cloak. how dreadful it will be in those days for pregnant women and nursing mothers. Pray that your flight will not take place in winter or on the Sabbath. For then there will be great distress, unequaled from the beginning of the world until now, and never to be equaled again. The scripture that he refers to, I believe, is Daniel 9, verse 27. Let's read that. He will put an end to sacrifice and offering. At the temple, he will set up an abomination that causes desolation until the end that is decreed is poured out on him. Let's continue. Looking at Daniel 11, verse 31. His armed forces will rise up to desecrate the temple fortress and will abolish the daily sacrifice. Then they will set up the abomination that causes desolation. Okay, so Jesus refers to the abomination that causes desolation. Now we're not actually sure, none of the commentaries were actually sure of what the abomination that causes desolation is. One thought I will tell you that I saw was when the Romans came in, there were bodies everywhere, and they took them and burned them, many of them, on the altar of God in the temple. And that very well could be what the abomination that causes desolation is, but I'm not sure. Then it says, let the reader understand. Now, it is thought, Matthew puts this in here, let the reader understand, and Mark in his gospel says the same thing when talking about this, let the reader understand. And it is thought that they added this to fix the attention on the reader to what Jesus was instructing them to do. These were instructions by Jesus to his followers, to the Christians, when this was all going to occur in AD 70. Jesus was telling them to flee, to get out. And we're told here, let the reader understand. Get busy. Get out. Flee. Now, these are the instructions that Jesus gave. Flee to the mountains. If you're outside, don't go back into the house. Don't even get your cloak. If you're pregnant and nursing, it's going to be really hard on you. Pray that it's not winter. Winter is a time when there are a lot of rains. It's difficult to travel then. And then pray that it's not on Sabbath. The Jews would close the gates on the Sabbath, not let anyone out, not let anyone in. And then he said it will be a day of great distress, and that is true. And he said it's never to be equaled again. So let's look at this. Last week, our last lesson, I told you, I referred to this and said there were probably like around 85,000 that died. That is not true. I was way off on that. Josephus says that 1,100,000 people perished during this time, and 97,000 were taken captive by the Romans. There were a huge number of people that died in Jerusalem. This was a siege of starvation, not just them overpowering the city. This did not happen in one day. It was a siege. Evidently, just before the siege, there had been uprisings against the Jews. I told you about, I referred to that already in this lesson. And the Jews were finding it very, very difficult. They were fearing for their lives, for their families, and so they would leave their homes, and they started going to Jerusalem. They were filling Jerusalem because they needed protection, and they knew that the walls of Jerusalem would not let anybody in. Well, there were so many people there, and it was providing them great protection. But the thing is, there wasn't enough food. There was not enough food for everyone. So they were starving. And it was what Jesus said. It was the distress inside the city from the starvation was unequaled from the beginning of the world until now, and never to be equaled again. I read an account of Roman soldiers who came to the houses, who were going into houses to plunder them. And these soldiers, when they walked in, the horror they saw when they walked in just made them back away, and they just left without touching anything. It must have been horrendous. So, verse 22 says, if those days had not been cut short, no one would survive. But for the sake of the elect, those days will be shortened. Now, this siege only lasted 4 months, 3 days. 4 months, 3 weeks, and 4 days. The Babylonian siege, years before, centuries before, lasted 30 months, 2.5 years. But this one, that was the shorter time, it was worse because of so many people. They ran out of food much earlier than they did during the Babylonian siege. So, verse 23, but I ask you a question. What kept this war from lasting a long time? And God kept it from lasting a long time. But for the sake of the elect, those days were shortened. Verse 23, at that time, if anyone says to you, look, here is the Messiah, or there he is, do not believe it. For false messiahs and false prophets will appear and perform great signs and wonders to deceive, if possible, even the elect. See, I have told you ahead of time. I'm telling you ahead of time what's going to happen. Pay attention. So if anyone tells you, there he is out in the wilderness, do not go out. Or here he is in the inner rooms, do not believe it. For as lightning that comes from the east is visible even in the west, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. Wherever there is a carcass, there vultures will gather. Okay, what in the world is he talking about here? All right, he's going back to the thing about false prophets, but what he's saying, I am telling you to flee. I am the Messiah. I am giving you instructions to get out when you start seeing these signs. But there will be false messiahs that will say, no, stay in the city. It's strong. We'll be okay. No, do not believe them. They're saying they're the Christ. They're telling you to do what God does not want you to do. This reminds me of Jeremiah. I don't know if you know the story about Jeremiah, but it's very similar. God had told Jeremiah to tell the people that they needed to leave the city. He said, if you will leave the city and go to the Babylonians, you will save your life. They will not kill you. But there were false prophets that God had not spoken to, that said, no, God told me to tell you to stay here. Stay here in the city, and we will overcome this. But that was not true. And they were overrun. They were The temple was destroyed at that time. The city was destroyed. They were taken captive. Thousands and thousands were killed. So Jesus was saying, don't listen to them. Don't listen to them. I have told you what's going to happen and what you need to do. So listen to me. Did they listen? Well, they did. Most of them did. The historian Eusebius wrote, the whole body of the church at Jerusalem, having been commanded by a divine revelation given to men of approved piety, there before the war removed from the city, and dwelt at a certain town beyond the Jordan, that's across the Jordan, called Pella. Now, it wasn't in AD 70 when they did this. It was in 66 AD. There was a man named, a soldier, named Cestius Gallus that laid siege to Jerusalem. This was in 66 AD. But, interesting, Josephus writes that this soldier and his army retired from the city. He left the city without any reason in the world. But the Christians evidently realized, okay, God is taking them away right now. It's time for us to flee. And they did. They fled. Josephus also wrote, many of the most eminent of the Jews swam away from the city as from a ship when it is going to sink. So they fled as fast as they could. Josephus also indicates that there were prophets performing signs and wonders during this siege and between 66 and 70. But the true believers didn't listen to them because they knew that they were just pretending. They were pretenders. They did not have the credentials that Jesus did. Then Jesus talks about, in verse 27, he said, for as lightning that comes from the east is visible even in the west, so will be the coming of man. Now he refers to the coming of man. The disciples are thinking the destruction of Jerusalem will be when the Son of Man returns, when the end of the age is. And he's saying, no. No. That is going to be obvious. The Son of Man, when the Son of Man comes, everyone will know immediately. Then he says something interesting. Wherever there is a carcass, there the vultures will gather. So the false Christs were vultures. They were flocking toward their prey. And their prey were the Jews who were suffering and who were fearful. And they were preying on them. Verse 29, immediately after the distress of those days, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, the stars will fall from the sky, and the heavenly bodies will be shaken. Wow, what is this? Well, now we are talking about the second coming. He's using apocalyptic judgment language here. Verse 29, when it says immediately after, this is put in here because Matthew wanted them to know that what he's about to tell them is not going to happen during the siege. And it's not going to happen at the destruction. The end of the age will not happen during the destruction of Jerusalem. It will not be then. Then will appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven. Oh, wait, let's talk about these visible lights. The sun, moon, and stars are the visible lights in the sky, aren't they? And they're going to be changed. Sun will be darkened, moon won't give its light, stars will fall from the sky. It just means that everything will be going to be different. It's going to be different. It's going to change. And this will happen, this change will happen simultaneously with the coming of the Son of Man. All right, Then will appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven. And then all the peoples of earth will mourn when they see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And he will send his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of the heavens to the other. All right, I want you to stay on verse 30, and we're going to look at Daniel chapter 7, verse 13. In my vision at night, I looked, and there before me was one like a son of man coming with the clouds of heaven. He approached the Ancient of Days and was led into his presence. Do you see coming with the clouds? What did he say in verse 30? The Son of Man, all the earth will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven. It's the same thing. Daniel was in this vision, and he was seeing this in his vision. And what did the Son of Man do? He was led into the presence of the Ancient of Days. Now let's read further. He was given authority, glory, and sovereign power. All nations and people of every language worshipped him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away, and his kingdom is one that will never be destroyed. All right, let's continue looking at this. He was given authority, glory, and sovereign power. Look at verse 30. They will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. Earlier in verse 30, it says, all the people of the earth will mourn. Later in verse 31, he says he's going to send his angels with a loud trumpet call. Peter, in his epistle, talked about there being a loud noise at the second coming. And the angels are going to gather the elect from the four winds, from all over the earth, and bring them. Everyone of every language will worship him. Every language worshiped him. And they will worship him. This is what it's talking about. Those who are of the elect will be worshiping him and will be celebrating with great joy. But what will happen to the rest of mankind on earth? What will they be doing? All the peoples of the earth will mourn. Will they be worshiping? Will they be worshiping him? Everyone, all nations and people, will they be worshiping him? Yes, they will be worshiping him. But they'll be mourning because they know that they had rejected the King. They had rejected the Son of Man. They had rejected the Christ. So, he goes on with verse 32. Now learn this lesson from the fig tree. As soon as its twigs get tender and its leaves come out, you know that summer is near. Even so, when you see all these things, you know that it is near, right at the door. All right, remember we have talked about the fig tree, and its leaves start getting tender and it bears its fruit. And this happens right before June, right around June, early summer. And it's a sign. And you know that when those leaves start coming out, summer's about to begin. Sort of like Texas, when you start sneezing and you start seeing yellow on your cars. Spring is coming. The spring is at the door. And so he's saying, he's saying, look at the signs. You'll know that it is near. It refers to the destruction of Jerusalem. Because he gives signs of when the destruction of Jerusalem is going to happen, right? Truly, I tell you, this generation will certainly not pass away until all these things have happened. Now, is he talking about the end of the age? No. He is telling them there are signs for the destruction of Jerusalem. There are no signs for the coming of the Son of Man, for the end of the age. There will be no signs, and he will elaborate on that too. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will never pass away. His dominion is an lasting dominion that will not pass away. And his words about the signs will not pass away either. They are true. So, verse 36. Keep in mind, he's just said about the signs. The signs are for the destruction of Jerusalem. But about that day, what day? About that day. No one knows. No one knows at what hour, at what day, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father. As it was in the days of Noah, so it will be at the coming of the Son of Man. For in the days before the flood, people were eating and drinking, marrying and given in marriage, up to the day Noah entered the ark. And they knew nothing about what would happen until the flood came and took them all away. That is how it will be at the coming of the Son of Man. Okay, what do you mean they didn't know? Wasn't Noah preaching to them? Probably, but they had never seen rain. They didn't know what a flood was. They had no conception of it. Just like we have no conception of what heavenly things are. We can only think in earthly terms. We have no conception of heavenly terms. You understand? So just like what happened with Noah, they had no conception what a flood was. They just didn't get it. We have no conception of what is going to change here. We can't even imagine it in our wildest imagination. Verse 40. 2 men will be in the field, one will be taken and the other left. 2 women will be grinding with a handmill, one will be taken and the other left. He's saying you won't know. You'll just be sitting there doing your work and all of a sudden it'll happen. One will be taken with the angels because they're gathering the elect, and one will be left to mourn. Therefore, keep watch. Keep watch, because you do not know what day the Lord will come. But understand this, if the owner of the house had known at what time of night the thief was coming, he would have kept watch and would not have let his house be broken into. So, you must also be ready. Be ready, because the Son of Man will come at an hour when you do not expect him. Who then is the faithful and wise servant whom the master has put in charge of the servants in his household to give them their food at the proper time? It will be good for that servant whose master finds him doing so when he returns. Truly, I tell you, he will put him in charge of all his possessions. So those that are ready, those that are not only keeping watch, but those that are ready will be fine. They will be put in charge of all his possessions. But suppose that servant is wicked and says to himself, my master is staying away a long time. And he then begins to beat his fellow servants and to eat and drink with drunkards. The master of that servant will come on a day when he does not expect him, and in an hour he is not aware of. He will cut him to pieces and assign him a place with the hypocrites. Hypocrites? Who are the hypocrites? Have we heard Jesus saying we're hypocrites? you know, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. We want to be the faithful and wise servant, don't we? Who do you think of when you think about the faithful and wise servant? Maybe the leaders of the church, taking care of their flock, yes. But what about the mother who is teaching her children about Jesus? What about the father who is the example of the wise servant to his children, raising them right? So, keep watch, be ready. Now, I do want to show you a couple more pictures, if you don't mind. This is Masada. I haven't done a lot of reading on this, but from what I understand, there were still Christians in Jerusalem when it was taken in 70 AD, and many of them were able to flee to Masada. Now, Masada was, there was a city built on Masada up here by Herod the Great. I mean, this is a massive mountain. I don't even know how they got up there, but there was a fortress up there, and it even had storehouses of food up here. So they were able to live up here for a while, and they took refuge up here at Masada. This is another picture of some ruins of Masada. They retreated here, and they were here almost 3 years, but the Romans built fortifications around the base of the mountain, and eventually they built a ramp all the way to the top. And it said that the night before the Romans entered Masada, all the Jews committed suicide rather than be captured. And this is thought to be a synagogue up there at Masada. And there is a hole down here, and it's thought to be a baptistry. So anyway, I just wanted you to see that. But next week, lesson 15, we will continue on with this teaching block, and we will finish that, and I will see you then. Alrighty, have a great day. Bye-bye.